Alright, this video is going to walk you through some of the key features of Python in terms of how it deals with variables. It'll also give you some indication of how to choose good variable names as you're writing your programs. First of all, you have to understand that a variable is actually a spot in memory where information is going to be stored, information that your program is going to be using. When we are naming variables, we want to make sure that we are as descriptive as possible. So if we're making a variable, for example, to store user's first name, we could call that variable user first name and mash those words together, start with a lowercase, and then use capitals for subsequent words. I'll show you an example of that in a minute. There are three kinds of variables that we have in Python. Strings, which will hold text and numbers that are not interpreted as numbers but interpreted as actual text, so to speak. So the letter 1 as opposed to the integer 1. Integers hold whole numbers, so those are um, uh, basically no decimal parts. So we can have negatives, 0, positives, no decimal part for any of those. Floats will hold any kind of number. It is an approximation because it obviously can't have arbitrary precision in a computer because there's a limited amount of memory. We can assign values to any variable. So for example, if we were to say user first name, or user first name perhaps would make more sense. So user is the first word in our variable name, lowercase, subsequent words we're going to capitalize, equals, and I'm going to say Bob. So that declares a variable user first name and initializes it to have the value Bob. You can't, unlike other languages, you cannot declare a variable without actually assigning a value to it. The assigning really allocates it as well. I can then output the contents of a variable by saying something like print user first name. And if I run that, you can see that the value of that variable has been output to the screen. We can actually change the type of a variable by changing what is assigned to it. So Python is smart in trying to figure out what kind of information you actually want to store. I could say, for example, print user first name is of type, and then I'm going to output what type it has. I can use the type function built into Python to do that. So let's run that. User first name is of type, and we can see str, which is for string. If I were to say user first name equals 5, and then I could copy this line and I'll paste it again. So now I've assigned the value 5 to user first name, and let's see what kind of type it has now. And you can see that now it has a type int. If I were to assign something that needs to have decimal places, 54.2, and then paste that same code again to output the type. Let's see what happens. And we can see that it, in that case, is considered a float. So you have to be very careful when you're using your variables in Python because it will allow you to assign any value to any variable without checking to see if it's the same type that it was before. So you can have some errors in your programs because of this. One other thing that is very common in programming languages is the idea of having constants. And a constant is like a variable, but in other languages it is protected from being modified. So a classic example of that is having something like the tax rate. So let's say tax rate. So the naming for constants is all capitals, subsequent words, separated with that underscore. So I can say tax rate equals 0.13, for example, for HST. And I can then use that, and the naming convention will hopefully remind you not to change what's in that variable. It's not protected like in other languages. So if we were in Java or C++ or C Sharp, if we tried to change the value of tax rate, it would actually output an error and not allow us to do that. But in Python we can. So we have to be careful ourselves to make sure that we don't do anything like that. So I can, if I want to, I could say tax rate equals hello. And there's nothing wrong with that in terms of the actual execution of the program, but clearly that would be some kind of a logical error in my source code. So you want to try to avoid doing things like that. The naming convention will hopefully remind you not to change the value of a constant.